What is going on, everybody? How is everybody doing today? Welcome here today to a video where we're going to be talking about every NBA team's worst draft pick of the 2010s. So some teams had a lot of bad draft picks where it was hard to choose which one was the worst, and some teams really didn't draft that bad at all throughout the decade. So I mainly looked at, did these players perform well? If they got hurt, I kind of took that in mind where I didn't want to be too mean to the team or to that player and say this was the worst pick if they were hurt all the time. But some teams had it where that player was really the worst pick of their decade, even though they got hurt a bunch of times. So I'm looking at it that way if they performed well enough, and then I'm going to look at it for you'll see for the Lakers later. They didn't really have a bad first round pick throughout the decade, but I'm going to choose one where there was better players selected after that player, and that said player was drafted high in the draft. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed these videos, don't forget to drop a thumbs up. Maybe I can do each team's best draft pick of the decade, something like that, if you guys want to see that. So if we could hit 1,500 likes on this video, I'd appreciate that a lot. Without further ado, let's get into the video. So we're going to start off with the Atlanta Hawks here, and their worst pick of the decade was Adreian Payne out of Michigan State, and he was the 15th overall pick in the 2014 draft. Payne ended up playing 3 games for the Hawks. Yeah, just 3 games, averaging 1.7 points, and played 6 minutes throughout those 3 games. This was by far their worst pick, where they spent a top 15 pick on, and he just didn't pan out at all. They ended up trading him to Minnesota in the 2015 season. For a 2018 first round pick, this was actually a great trade for them because they ended up using that first select Kevin Huerter in the 2018 draft. So yeah, Adreian Payne ended up playing 3 seasons in Minnesota, then he played 1 season with Orlando in 2018 and hasn't been in the NBA since. Let's stick with the 2014 NBA draft, and the Celtics' worst pick of the decade is going to be James Young out of Kentucky. He was the 17th overall pick in that draft. So maybe James Young is most notably known for when Bill Simmons was working with ESPN and he got selected in the 2014 draft. He fist pumped when he didn't think the camera was on him, and it kind of showed his bias for Boston. But yeah, he ended up playing 3 seasons in Boston. He played 31 games in his rookie year and then 29 games in 2016 and 2017. So in those 89 games, he averaged 2 points, 1 rebound. He shot 27% from 3, 36% from the field, 54% from the line, was not a good defender whatsoever. He ended up playing his 2018 season with Philadelphia, where he pretty much did the same thing and has been out of the league since. Moving over to the Brooklyn Nets, I'm going to have their worst pick of the decade be Chris McCullough out of Syracuse, and he was the 29th overall pick in the 2015 draft. Now, when you're looking at Brooklyn, honestly, they didn't have many first round picks in this decade that they were able to keep, because obviously those trades with Boston, that kind of gave up all their first round picks. And then obviously the 2012 draft as well, where they traded Gerald Wallace for basically the pick that ended up becoming Damian Lillard. But yeah, you look at the picks that they actually made. In 2010, they had the 3rd pick in the draft. They selected Derek Favors. He turned out to be an okay player. He was a top 10 player from that draft class. In 2013, they drafted Mason Plumlee, 22nd overall. That turned out to be a good pick. In 2017, they got Jarrett Allen, 22nd overall. That was a solid pick. So yeah, it really didn't turn out to be that many of bad picks for the Nets throughout the decade. But McCullough pretty much was the worst first round pick that they had. He ended up averaging 4.7 points per game for the Nets in 24 games before getting traded to Washington in his 2nd season, where he only played 14 games for Brooklyn then, and then he ended up playing just 21 games in 2 seasons in Washington. Like Payne and like James Young, he has not played in the NBA since 2018. So we're moving over to our first team now that had multiple horrendous picks throughout the decade, the Charlotte Hornets. So it came down between Cody Zeller from the 2013 draft, Noah Vonleh from the 2014 draft, Frank Kaminsky from the 2015 draft. It could even be Malik Monk from the 2017 draft, but I'm going to end up going with their pick from 2012, where they selected Michael Kidd-Gilchrist 2nd overall. So Kidd-Gilchrist actually played 7 straight seasons for the Hornets, averaging about 9 points, 5.5 rebounds, and shot 27% from 3, 47% from the field before getting waived by them in this 2020 season. Then he was picked up by Dallas. Kidd-Gilchrist has always been known as a solid perimeter defender in the NBA. He's a guy that you wouldn't mind guarding a team's 3 or 4 best option on the offensive end. But on the offensive side of the ball for Kidd-Gilchrist, he really never found his way there. He has one of the worst jump shots in NBA history, where he shoots it literally from the left side of his face. And yeah, Bradley Beal was the pick after him. Damian Lillard was a couple picks later. So this was a big miss for Charlotte here, and they've had multiple bad picks of the decade, but I'm going with Kidd-Gilchrist from the 2012 draft. Moving over to Chicago, their worst pick of the decade is going to be Doug McDermott, who was selected 11th overall in the 2014 NBA draft. What makes this pick so bad is because the Bulls basically gave up the rights to Yusuf Nurkic and Gary Harris, so they traded up to get Doug McDermott while pretty much giving up two players that ended up being better players than Doug McDermott, and he only played in 2 seasons in Chicago before getting traded to OKC in his 3rd season with the Bulls. In his first 2 years with the Bulls, where he played in 117 games, he averaged 7.5 points, and he did shoot 41% from 3, but he just really never found his way in Chicago. He's actually been a pretty solid player for the Pacers now for the last couple years, but in Chicago, this was just a bad pick for the Bulls, and it's going to come in as their worst pick from the 2010s. So coming in for the Cavs, this one is an obvious one. It's potentially the worst pick of all time. It's definitely the worst pick of the 2010s, and that is going to be selecting Anthony Bennett, number 1 overall in the 2013 draft. Anthony Bennett only played 1 year in Cleveland, where he averaged 4 points, 3 rebounds in 13 minutes a night as the number 1 overall pick, and then was traded to Minnesota in the 2014 offseason and the Andrew Wiggins for Kevin Love trade. And you might be like, all right, yeah, he was just an asset after his first year. He was the 1st overall pick. The Timberwolves got something good out of that. No, he was only in this trade because they needed to match the salary to get to whatever Kevin Love's contract was at the time, and they had to throw in Bennett's 1st overall contract, which was what, 7-8 mil in there, to help that trade go through. He was literally a salary filler in this trade after his first year as the number 1 overall pick. He ended up playing in Minnesota in 2015, Toronto in 2016, and then Brooklyn in 2017. And he's been on the Rockets G League team from now and then for the last couple years, but he has not played in the NBA since 2017. Moving over to Dallas now, their pick is going to be Justin Anderson, who they took 21st overall from the 2015 draft. You might say this spot should belong to Dennis Smith Jr., but he really wasn't that bad for Dallas, and he helped them get Kristaps Porzingis, so I wasn't really going to throw that in for them. And they didn't make a lot of first-round draft picks that were bad, so Anderson was a hard one to come around. Anderson was someone that really never lived up to his full potential. He was selected 21st overall, and he was traded to Philly in his 2nd season. He was in the Nerlens Noel trade, I believe, and he averaged 4 points in his rookie season, shot 40% from the field, and pretty much wasn't better than any of that throughout the rest of his career. He had some great defensive potential coming out of Virginia, where pretty much every player out of that school always has some type of defensive potential, and then he bounced around between Philly, Atlanta. He was on Brooklyn for 3 games where he played in this year in 2020, so he's still on an NBA roster, which is great for him, but he just really didn't live up to the hype as being a first-round pick out of Virginia back in 2015. Let's move over to Denver now, where they've made some dumb draft night trades where they traded out of Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell. They've helped out the Jazz a lot, but their worst pick of the decade is going to be Emmanuel Mudiay, the 7th overall pick in the 2015 draft. Mudiay played 2.5 seasons in Denver before getting traded to the New York Knicks in the 2018 season. He averaged around 12 points per game and shot 36% from the field in Denver. He really just never found his way as a shooter in the NBA. He was looked at as this top point guard prospect, the number 2 point guard in that draft behind D'Angelo Russell, and he just ended up being a bust pretty much for the Nuggets, where he was ended up traded for Devin Harris, where they got in that 3-team trade, where Mudiay was ended up moving to the Knicks, and then Doug McDermott to the Mavericks. He did play for the Utah Jazz this season in 2020. He averaged 7 points for them and shot 47% from the field. He's not a bad backup point guard in the NBA whatsoever if he's playing around 14 to 18 minutes a night, but he just never turned out to be that starting point guard where people thought he could be an all-star one day. And yeah, another bad pick from the 2015 draft. And then the next team is going to be from the 2015 draft. So Detroit, yeah, their worst pick of the decade is going to be Stanley Johnson, the 8th overall pick from the 2015 draft. I actually had a debate here either to put Stanley Johnson or Henry Ellison as this pick, but I ended up going with Stanley Johnson, who played 3.5 seasons in Detroit before getting traded to the Pelicans in the 2019 season. But in those 3.5 seasons, he averaged 7 points, 3.5 rebounds, and shot 37% from the field for the Detroit Pistons. A couple picks later in this draft was Devin Booker and Miles Turner, so they didn't do well here with the 9th overall pick. The Pistons haven't been the best drafting team in the last 20 years, but this pick right here really didn't turn out to be a good one, and Stanley Johnson is going to be the biggest draft blunder for the Pistons in the last 10 years. The Golden State Warriors have been a great drafting team. They drafted Steph Curry in 2009, Klay Thompson in 2011, Draymond Green in 2012, but their worst pick of the decade is going to come in the 2010 draft, where they selected Ekpe Udoh 6th overall. He ended up playing 2 seasons in Golden State before getting traded to Milwaukee in the 2012 season, where he averaged a amazing 4.8 points a night, 3.7 rebounds, and shot 43% from the field. He was also selected in front of Gordon Hayward and Paul George. So yeah, even the best drafting teams have some bad ones from time to time. The Houston Rockets' worst pick of the 2010s is going to be Royce White from the 2012 draft. He was selected 16th overall out of Iowa State. I'm not going to crap on Royce White too much just because I know he didn't play in the NBA mainly because of mental illness, and he wasn't really suited to play in the NBA at that point, but it still turned out to be one of their worst picks from the decade. He ended up not even playing at all for the Houston Rockets, and then he ended up like released, and then he came back and he played 3 games for Sacramento in 2014, and he just ended up being kind of a waste of a pick in 2016. It is a shame because a lot of people thought he could be this next great thing and he was going to be kind of like a really good player, but yeah, he just really didn't do anything in the NBA, unfortunately, and he's going to come in as the worst pick for the Rockets in the 2010s. Let's talk about the Indiana Pacers now, and their worst pick is going to come from the 2017 draft, the man out of UCLA, and that is going to be TJ Leaf, who was selected 18th overall. This is going to be the first player from the 2017 draft, and Leaf, in his first 3 years, has averaged 3.3 points per game. He has shot 49% from the field. He has not been a good defender whatsoever for the Pacers. He was the 18th overall pick, and he has averaged 8.5 minutes a night in his first 3 years. I don't think he'll be on the Pacers past his second contract when the team option runs up at the end of the 2021 season, unless he has a really good season next year. I'm just not buying it. He has not been a good player in the NBA whatsoever, and he's going to make the spot here for the Pacers' worst pick of the decade. This pick here by the Clippers, I don't know what they were thinking here in the 2018 draft. This is going to be from the most recent draft that really we can make a name for, and that is going to be the Clippers selecting Jerome Robinson out of Boston College, 13th overall in the 2018 draft. Robinson played in pretty much 33 games in his rookie year and then 42 games in his sophomore year for pretty much being a salary dump to the Washington Wizards in his sophomore year. He averaged 3.5 points and shot 36% from the field for the Clippers in that year and a half. Let's list some players that went after Jerome Robinson that would have been a much better pick. Michael Porter Jr., Dante DiVincenzo, Lonnie Walker, Kevin Huerter, Josh Okogie, Aaron Holiday, Landry Shamet, Javon Carter, Jalen Brunson, Devontae Graham, Mitchell Robinson. The Clippers definitely whiffed on this pick. Yes, they did get Shai Gilgeous in this draft, which was great for them, but the pick after was just a head scratcher for a lot of reasons. A lot of people didn't really think Robinson would even go in the top 20, let alone going in the lottery to a good team like the Clippers. And coming in for the Lakers, before you get mad at me, let me explain this one. It is going to be Lonzo Ball, who was selected 2nd overall in the 2017 draft. So the Lakers were actually a great drafting team throughout this decade, and Lonzo Ball is looking like he was a solid pick at the 2nd overall selection there. I ended up going with, it could have been Anthony Brown, who was the 34th pick in 2015, but he didn't even play for them. But I wanted to go for a meaningful pick here, and the Lakers made a couple meaningful picks in this decade. They took Brandon Ingram, 2nd overall in the 2016 draft. He turned out to be a pretty solid player. He was obviously in the Anthony Davis trade. D'Angelo Russell was the 2nd overall pick in the 2015 draft. He was a solid player for them when they were rebuilding, but they wanted to get rid of him to select Lonzo Ball. And then they also got Julius Randle, 7th overall in the 2014 draft. But the reason why I went with Lonzo is just the players that were picked after him, specifically a point guard that went 3 picks later that turned out to be a better point guard than him, as we've seen so far in De'Aaron Fox. Yes, Jason Tatum was the pick right after. Then you had guys like Lauri Markkanen, Jonathan Isaac, Donovan Mitchell, John Collins that you could make a case for, and also Bam Adebayo that could also be a more valuable pick at the 2nd overall selection over Lonzo Ball. I'm not saying Lonzo Ball is a bust, because that is the furthest thing from what I'm saying. He's a good NBA player. He could be an all-star one day, and he might be, but I just think if you're going to pick between him, Ingram, and D'Lo, I'm going with Lonzo out of those 3. And let me know in the comments if you would go with maybe Julius Randle or you would even choose Anthony Brown. But I wanted to keep this to first-round picks, but it was just hard to figure that out here. Memphis wasn't a bad drafting team throughout the decade either, but I'm going to go with Wade Baldwin, who they took 17th overall in the 2016 draft out of Vanderbilt. Baldwin only ended up playing 1 season in Memphis, 33 games where he averaged 12 minutes a night, 3 points, a rebound and a half, 2 steals, and shot 31% from the field. I'm sure the Grizzlies would love to get that pick back in 2016. Remember when I said I want all these picks to be in the first round? Yeah, this is going to be an exception for the Miami Heat, and I'll explain why, but I'm going to have them as their worst pick of the decade be Dexter Pittman, who was selected 32nd overall in the second round in the 2010 draft out of Texas. So if you look at the Heat's first round picks in the 2010s, they didn't have one in 2010, they didn't have one in 2011, they traded it in 2012 to Philly, in 2014 they traded it to Charlotte, in 2015 they selected Justice Winslow 10th overall, they took Josh Richardson 40th overall in that draft, in 2017 they took Bam Adebayo with the 14th pick, and then 2019 Tyler Hero with the 13th pick. They've either not had a first round pick or actually drafted a solid player with that pick, but I'm going to go with Dexter Pittman, who was 3 picks away from being a first round pick, and then he's going to be their worst pick of the decade, and this is a pretty good one to be if he's going to be a second round pick as your worst pick of the decade. He played in 41 games for the Heat before getting traded to the Memphis Grizzlies. He averaged 3 points, 2 rebounds, and shot 46% from the field. Pat Riley, you are a genius. I had some debate here with the Milwaukee Bucks, and I'll say who I thought it could be after I announce who it was, and their worst pick of the decade is going to be Thon Maker, who was selected 10th overall in the 2016 draft. I did think about Jabari Parker, who was selected 2nd overall in the 2014 draft, but injuries derailed his career, and he ended up not being that bad of a player. Like, he's still playing in the NBA for the Sacramento Kings. But Thon Maker, who is also playing in the NBA currently, but he has just been pretty much horrible every season of his career. He played 2.5 seasons for the Milwaukee Bucks before getting traded to Detroit, but he averaged 4 points, 2.5 rebounds. He shot 33% from 3, and the reason why he was selected 10th overall is because people thought he could be kind of like what Giannis was, like this guy who's super tall, he's a good ball handler for his size, he can kind of be that freak of nature with that size, strength, and speed. But he just turned out to be a pretty big bust at the 10th overall pick. He didn't end up being a good defender, he got hurt a lot, and he just couldn't stay on the floor because he was just kind of a liability, and he's going to come in as the worst Bucks draft pick of the decade. Let's move over to a team that has had multiple bad picks in the last 10 years, but I ended up going with Derrick Williams out of Arizona for the Minnesota Timberwolves' worst pick of the decade, and he was selected 2nd overall in the 2011 draft. Notable guys selected after Derrick Williams: Kemba Walker, Kawhi Leonard, Klay Thompson, Jimmy Butler. Even picks like Tristan Thompson, Enes Kanter, Jonas Valanciunas, the Morris twins, Nikola Vucevic, Tobias Harris. They all would have been better picks than Derrick Williams, who was kind of this athletic dunker out of Arizona, and he just didn't pan out at all in the NBA. He played 2.5 seasons in Minnesota before getting traded to Sacramento. He did average 9.5 points and 5 rebounds and shot 42% from the field. He then played 74 games in Sacramento, then went to the Knicks, then the Heat, then Cleveland, and he was on LA in 2018, but he hasn't played since, and he's probably not going to play in the NBA ever again. The Pelicans weren't a bad drafting team throughout the decade either. They really made like 2 questionable picks. But I'm going with Austin Rivers, who was selected 10th overall in the 2012 draft out of Duke. Now, Rivers isn't a bad player at all whatsoever. He's been a good role player on the Clippers, the Wizards, and the Rockets for the last 5 years. But the 10th overall pick in the draft, and if you look at the Pelicans' first-round picks throughout the decade, this one, like, in sheer terms of value and what you want out of the 10th overall selection, this was a bad pick for them. He ended up playing 2.5 years in New Orleans before getting traded to the Clippers for a bunch of players and picks that were in a 3-team trade with the Grizzlies and the Celtics. Rivers is actually a pretty solid kind of 3-point shooter off the bench for the Rockets now, but he is going to be the worst pick for the Pelicans in the decade. Moving over to the Big Apple now, the Knicks' worst pick of the 2010s is going to be Kevin Knox, who was the 9th overall pick in 2018. If you actually look at the Knicks' first-round picks from 2010 on, it really hasn't been that bad. They had no first-round pick in 2010. In 2011, they took Iman Shumpert, 17th overall. Good pick there. They didn't have a first-round pick in 2012. In 2013, they took Tim Hardaway Jr. with the 24th pick. Good pick there. 2014, no first-round pick. 2015, they took Kristaps with the 4th pick. Great pick there. 2016, no first-round pick. 2017, I thought about Frank Ntilikina here, but I think Frank Ntilikina has been a better player than Kevin Knox so far, who they took with the 9th pick in 2018, and he has not been a good player in his sophomore year for the Knicks. He did show some promise as a potential good scorer in the NBA in his rookie year, but this year, his defense was horrible, maybe the worst defensive player in the NBA. He just looks confused on defense. He has horrible footwork on defense. His defense is just kind of horrible all around. He's a solid 3-point shooter, but the Knicks really don't give him a chance at all to shine there, and he's going to be the worst Knicks pick of the decade. The OKC Thunder had the last lottery pick in the 2015 draft, and they selected their worst pick of the decade, and that was Cameron Payne out of Murray State. Payne played in 77 games in 2 years for the Thunder before getting traded to Chicago, where he ended up being like tank master Cameron Payne. But he averaged 5 points, 2 assists, and a rebound and a half for the Thunder, while also shooting 37% from the field and 32% from three. But he could dance though. With the 5th pick in the 2015 draft, the Magic ended up taking their worst pick of the decade, and that was Mario Hezonja. Hezonja played in 3 seasons, 219 games for the Magic, averaging around 17 points per night and shot 41% from the field before the Magic not even extending his team option in the 4th year and let him be an unrestricted free agent. He ended up signing with the Knicks. He was okay for them. He did dunk over Giannis, which was cool, and pointed at LeBron after blocking him on a game winner, but he wasn't really a good player nonetheless in the NBA. He wasn't great for Portland either this year, and he has been a bust in the NBA. For the 76ers, man, this one was tough. It could have been Evan Turner from the 2010 draft, Michael Carter-Williams from the 2013 draft, Jahlil Okafor from 2015, or Fultz from 2017. But I ended up going with Jahlil Okafor, who was the 3rd overall pick in the 2015 draft. Okafor was selected 1 pick ahead of Kristaps Porzingis, and with Joel Embiid already on the roster coming back in a year from now, this wasn't a great pick whatsoever. He did average 17.5 points and 7 rebounds in his rookie year, but this was on a horrible Philadelphia team who ended up getting the 1st overall pick in that draft. Obviously took Ben Simmons, but then he just kind of went down in everything the year later, and then was traded to Brooklyn in the 2018 season. He played a little bit for them, and he hasn't been that bad for the Pelicans in 2019 and 2020. He's been a good center off the bench, but he really can't play defense. He's still kind of slow. He can't shoot. In the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, he would have been maybe the best center of that decade, but here he's going to come in as the worst draft pick of this decade for the Philadelphia 76ers. Another team that just had a plethora of bad picks, the Phoenix Suns. I ended up going with Dragan Bender, who was the 4th overall pick in 2016. He played 3 seasons for the Suns, where he averaged 5 points, and he ended up shooting 39% from the field in 20 minutes a night. And then, like Hezonja, his team option wasn't picked up in his 4th year. He ended up signing with Milwaukee, or he signed with Golden State and then was traded, and he has not been a good player in the NBA whatsoever. He just didn't be that 3-point shooter that people thought he could be. He really couldn't pass the ball. He was kind of weak. He wasn't strong on defense, and he ended up being a big bust for the Suns here with the 4th pick in 2016. Coming in for the Blazers' worst pick of the decade, it's going to be Nolan Smith, who was the 21st overall pick in the 2011 draft out of Duke. I actually thought Nolan Smith could have been a really good player in the NBA, but he just didn't pan out at all. He played 2 seasons for the Blazers and hasn't played in the NBA since 2013 after his 2nd year. He averaged 3 points for the Blazers, shot 37% from the field and 26% from 3. They didn't have a lot of high draft picks that they whiffed on in this decade, but this one at 21 in the 2011 draft was a big whiff by them. The Sacramento Kings, another team that just had a lot of bad picks of the decade, and their worst one is going to be Thomas Robinson, who was the 5th overall pick in 2012. Robinson played in 51 games for the Kings. He was traded in his rookie year, and he was the 5th overall pick. That is just insane. He ended up averaging 4.8 points for the Kings. He was a head case going into pre-draft interviews and workouts. He bounced around between Houston, Portland, Philly, Brooklyn, and he was on the Lakers in the 2017 season, but he hasn't played in the NBA since. So coming in for the San Antonio Spurs, it is going to be Nikola Milutinov, who was the 26th pick in the 2015 draft. Yeah, he hasn't played in the NBA yet. That's why he's going to be their worst pick of the decade. He could still come over from overseas, but yeah, he hasn't played a single minute in the NBA. He's been a waste of a 1st-round pick for them so far, and the Spurs have been a great drafting team, so it was kind of hard to find who this could be. But I ended up going with Nikola here as the worst Spurs pick of the decade. Moving over to the reigning NBA champion Toronto Raptors, their worst pick of the decade is going to be Bruno Caboclo, who was the 20th overall pick in the 2014 draft. Mr. 2 years away from being 2 years away. In his 35 career games in 4 seasons with the Raptors, he averaged 1.5 points in 6 minutes a night. He has been a big bust in the NBA. He was supposed to be the Brazilian Kevin Durant. He didn't end up being that at all in the slightest, and he's going to come in as the worst draft pick the Raptors made in the 2010s. Moving over to the second to last team, it's going to be the Utah Jazz, and their worst pick is going to be Dante Exum, who was the 5th overall pick in the 2014 draft. Now, so many people were high on Exum going into that draft, and he could have been a really good player in the NBA, but he did tear his ACL twice in the 2016 season and in the 2018 season. It turns out that this wasn't really a horrible pick by the Jazz, kind of like throughout their scouting department. Obviously, they didn't know he was going to tear his ACL twice, like Jabari Parker did when I mentioned him for the Bucks. But I ended up going with Exum because he was kind of their highest pick that ended up not being anything in the NBA. And then if you look at some of the people selected after him, turned out to be a lot better. Who knows, though? Exum could have been one of the best point guards in the NBA if he didn't get hurt, but we can't use what it coulda, shouldas, and he's going to come in as the worst draft pick for the Jazz in the 2010s. And finally, the Washington Wizards' worst pick of the last decade is going to be Jan Vesely, who was the 6th overall pick in the 2011 draft. Vesely only played in 2 full seasons with the Wizards. In 108 games, he averaged 3.5 points, 3.5 rebounds, and he played not a lick of defense. He was then traded to the Denver Nuggets in his 3rd season and then wasn't in the NBA since. Yeah, he hasn't been in the NBA since 2014. And if you look at that 2011 draft, Klay Thompson, Kawhi Leonard, Jimmy Butler, all the guys I mentioned before in that 2011 draft that the Timberwolves selected Derrick Williams over, yeah, the Wizards could have done the same here, and that is going to be their worst pick of the decade. So yeah, that is going to be for me. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Let me know if you disagree with any of these picks and you would have picked a different player as a team's worst pick of the decade in the comment section below. And yeah, if you guys are enjoying these videos, don't forget to drop a thumbs up. It really means a lot to me, and I love you guys. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.